In this video, I will show you how to install VNC on Ubuntu Server 24 and connect to its graphical user interface using a VNC viewer. We'll begin by installing and configuring the VNC server, specifically TightVNC. Then, I'll demonstrate how to enable multi-user access, how to configure the firewall, and how to create a systemd unit to ensure the VNC server starts automatically at system reboot. Note that this guide is specifically for Ubuntu Server. VNC isn't ideal for Ubuntu Desktop. Instead, I would recommend using tools like NoMachine, AnyDesk, or TeamViewer. You'll also find a link in the description with all the commands and configurations used in this demonstration. In this lab setup, I have an Ubuntu 24 virtual machine with the IP address 192.168.1.10. Now we'll configure it with the VNC server. So let's get started. Our first step is to install a desktop environment. We'll be installing Xfce, which is lightweight and well-suited for use with VNC. With Xfce installed, our next step is to install the VNC server. We'll be using the TightVNC Server package for that. Now that we've installed the VNC server, it's time to start it for the first time. The command for that is VNC Server. The important thing is, you should not run it as root or with sudo. Just run the command from the user account you want to use for remote access. Here I'm going to run the command as user1, which is the account I want to use for remote connection. This is the first time we're running the VNC server command, so it will prompt us to create a password for this user. You'll also have the option to set a view-only password if you need it. Here the VNC server command started a new desktop with an ID of 1. Since we didn't specify an ID, it automatically assigned the number 1. Another thing that happened is, it created a hidden folder called .vnc in the user's home directory. In this folder, you'll find the PID file associated with the desktop session, along with the log file and startup script. The startup script is called xstartup, and we need to make some modifications to it before we can connect to the desktop. To do that, first we need to stop the VNC server. Type VNC server -kill, followed by the desktop ID with a colon. Now open the xstartup file in a text editor and replace its configuration with this one. And that's all we need to do for now. So let's start a new desktop session with the VNC server command. This time, we'll specify a desktop ID and set the resolution using the -geometry option. The command was successful, and it created a new desktop with ID 1. We can also run the ps command and see that there's a TightVNC process with ID 1. So now let's try to connect to this desktop remotely using a VNC viewer. In the VNC viewer's address field, type the IP address or hostname of the Ubuntu server, followed by a colon and the desktop ID. And it works. We now have a connection to the VNC Desktop 1 as user 1. If you need multiple people to connect to the VNC server at the same time, you've got two choices. One is to allow shared access to the same desktop using the same user. To do that, make sure to run the VNC server command with the -always-shared option. This way, everyone connects to the same desktop using the same user and password. As you can see here, the two sessions are mirrored, meaning any changes made in one session are reflected in the other. This is if you want shared displays. But if you want isolated displays, you need to start separate VNC server instances under different users, each with a different desktop ID. So here what I'm going to do is add a new user called user2. Next, we'll log into user2 and repeat the same steps we did for user1. First, we'll set a VNC password for user2. Next, we'll add the necessary configuration to the xstartup script. After that, we'll start a new desktop, but this time with ID 2. Now let's connect to desktop 2. As you can see, we now have two separate connections, one connecting to user 1 and the other to user 2. If the server is behind a firewall, you'll need to open the relevant VNC port. But first, it's important to understand how the VNC port works. The port that VNC listens on depends on the desktop ID. It's calculated as 5900 plus the desktop ID. For example, Desktop 1 will use port 5901, Desktop 2 will use port 5902, and a desktop with ID 5 will use port 5905. VNC also uses a 6000 port range for X11 connections, but you don't need to open these ports for VNC connections through a VNC viewer. Right now on our Ubuntu server, we currently have two desktops running, Desktop 1 and Desktop 2. If we run the ss command, we can see two VNC ports in listening mode, 5901 for Desktop 1 and 5902 for Desktop 2. I will now enable the Ubuntu firewall on this server. First, I'll add a rule to allow SSH connections. Remember, before enabling the firewall, you must ensure there's a rule allowing SSH traffic. Otherwise, you could lock yourself out of your own server. Now that the firewall is active, we won't be able to access either desktop. Opening port 5901 will allow access to Desktop 1, but not Desktop 2. To allow access to Desktop 2, we need to open port 5902. And now we should be able to connect to both desktops. Before finishing this section, one of the simplest ways to troubleshoot a connection is to use Telnet from the remote computer to the server's IP address on the VNC port. If Telnet fails to connect, it means the port is likely not open or blocked to the remote computer. Up to this point, we've manually started and stopped VNC desktops using the VNC Server command. Now, we'll automate this process by creating systemd services for each desktop. This will also enable us to manage VNC desktops using the systemctl command. Let's make a systemd service for Desktop 1. For that, we need to create a unit file in etc systemd system folder. Name the file VNC Server @ followed by the desktop ID with a .service extension. Next, add this configuration to the file. Just make sure to replace your username with the Linux user that starts the desktop. In this case, it will be user1. Next, save the file and reload systemd to apply the changes. If we check the status of VNC Server 1, it's disabled, meaning it won't start automatically. We'll enable it to start automatically using the systemctl enable command. Now let's reboot the system. After the reboot, we should be able to connect to Desktop 1. To do the same for desktop too, create a systemd unit named VNC Server at 2.service. Then, inside the VNC Server at 2.service file, change the user to a different user. In this case, it will be user 2. Now both desktops should start automatically. Another thing I want to mention is that starting a VNC server as a systemd service allows us to log into the local session and a remote session simultaneously. For some reason, this wasn't possible when starting the VNC server manually using the VNC Server command. And one more thing, you can now stop and restart the VNC desktops using the systemctl command. If you need to change the VNC password for a user, just log in as that user and run the command VNC passwd. This command also allows you to set a view-only password. In view-only mode, the user can see the desktop but cannot interact with it using the keyboard or mouse. However, the view-only session will mirror other active sessions on the same desktop, allowing the user to see any activity on the screen. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. If you found this information useful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel.